Hey folks, so we're jumping right on into our next unit, which is ancient Greece. And as always, we're going to start our look at ancient Greece by taking a brief look at geography. We're actually going to take a little bit of a look at the timeline of Greece as well, and we'll talk about some of the early eras of Greek history. The major question for this unit is going to be, in what ways is ancient Greece the blueprint for modern democratic lifestyles? So kind of what connections can we make between ancient Greece and the developments and progress and advancements that they made and the things that we still use and celebrate today, perhaps in different ways, but still use today in our modern democratic lifestyles. So this here is a brief timeline of Greece. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. We'll be spending most of our focus in this unit on classical Greece. But today we'll talk a little bit about the early period, and we will of course look a little bit at the early classical period as well. And then certainly our next unit will be on Rome, so we'll focus a lot on the Roman Empire when we get there. But we'll talk about Alexander the Great and all of this kind of stuff in here. Definitely a much shorter lived civilization than the two that we've looked at before, but very impactful in terms of legacy, in terms of really everything that we remember from the ancient Greek peoples. And a lot of that probably is because we have just so much more from them, so much more that we've been able to find in terms of archaeological records, written records. There's just more stuff there, especially because it is a much earlier period. Like I said, our focus is going to be classical Greece, and we're looking at, that starting in 480 BCE. If you think about 480 BCE in terms of Mesopotamia and Egypt, that was very, very, very late in the civilizations when they were already starting to decline in one way or another. And that's really when Greece is reaching its height. So the fact that it is much closer in terms of time to us today obviously means that we've just got more from them. So in terms of geography, what I want you to do is just pause the video in a second, and again, like we always have, try and take note of the advantages and disadvantages that you see based on the Greek area. And for the Greek area, we're obviously looking at the Greek mainland here, but really everything around the Aegean Sea, and even for portions of Greek history, the sort of side of Turkey right here, this kind of western side of Turkey. So pause the video, see what you notice, and then come back and we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of the positives or the advantages of the Greek geography, some of the things that you maybe noted, very similar to things that we might have noted in our other units, are closeness to water. Certainly that's very important in this case. Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean Sea, the fact that it is very close for trade and travel is obviously a benefit for the Greek peoples because they have easy access to each other, but they also have easy access to kind of the entire ancient world for trade, for export, import, anything that they might want to do. You also have many, many islands. If you go back to the map, you can see that it's not just one big mainland. It's also not one big strip around a river or a series of rivers like we've seen previously. You've got a lot of water, but you've got very separate islands. You've got very separate mainlands. And so in terms of the positives of that, again, it's really good for trade, it's good for culture, idea exchange, defense, because it's really hard to get large ships around some of those smaller islands. So that's really good for them. Also, you've got a lot of many natural harbors. So you've got a lot of ports, you've got a lot of places for ships to dock, for people to come in. Again, obviously that could be seen as a negative thing, but obviously a positive as well. And you've got a lot of mountains, which is things that we've talked about before in terms of being good for defense, but also things that could be problematic certainly come up with having such a mountainous area that you're living on. In terms of those negatives, the fact that it is mostly mountains actually leaves very little land for planting. You've only got about 1/5 of the land that's available and accessible for things like farmland. So where we talked about fertility a lot with Mesopotamia and Egypt, Obviously, there are areas of Greece that are fertile, but that's not their kind of main positive for them. So they really do need to focus on trade. They need to focus on importing certain goods in order to maintain their civilization. There's also no major rivers. If you look back to the main lands and the larger map, you can see that on all of these like larger island chunks, you don't have any rivers. So getting from one side of the island to the other side, sure, you can take a boat around the Aegean Sea, but it's very difficult in terms of travel across the mainland. Also, not great for communication in terms of communicating between city-states, and that will be something that we're going to talk about in a little bit in the course. You've also got, as I said, many natural harbors and many islands. We talked about how that could be a positive thing. It's also a negative thing. There's very little to no sense of unity in ancient Greece, and that's true for the vast majority of Greek history. You've got a lot of very separate city-states developing, and they are fiercely independent. We'll take a look at Sparta and Athens in the next lesson and talk about the extremes of those two areas and the comparisons that could be made between them. But certainly the fact that you've got this development of very, very separate, very independent city-states is really important because it makes it very difficult for the Greek people to work together. All of the city-states believe in very different things. They're very different kinds of people. There is no sense of Greece as we see it today and as we understand it today. Our idea of ancient Greece is our construct. It's what we've put onto the Greek people. They never thought of themselves as Greeks. They thought of themselves as Athenians or Spartans or Corinthians or Thebans. They never thought of themselves as Greeks. So that's obviously a detriment, as we will see when they get into battle. Also, it means that trade is a necessity, which we talked about. Yes, they've got a lot of waterways in terms of being able to trade well, but they really do need to trade. And that could, of course, be a negative depending on who they're trying to trade with and what their partners' ideas are about that trade. Now, if we're thinking about the timeline, the first peoples I want to talk about are actually not Greek peoples per se at all. They are the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. And the Minoans and the Mycenaeans are sort of the precursors to the Greeks. They are two very separate, very distinct cultures. The Minoans, you can see the dates here, very early civilization, fits right in the middle with Mesopotamia and Egypt. But they're not real Greeks, not in terms of the classical Greece that we know. This was a civilization that was based on Crete. If you go back to the map, it's one of the largest island towards the south. The Palace of Knossos was the major palace there, and that's where we get a lot of our records about these Minoan peoples from. They had two forms of writing, Linear A and Linear B. Linear A has never been deciphered, so we have no idea what they were writing about there. But Linear B seems to be a form of early Greek and has been deciphered. So there is obviously some kind of a connection between the Minoans and the Greeks. It's just a little bit unclear as to what it is. The Minoans themselves are a very non-violent people. You can see these two mosaics at the bottom here. They're very focused on things like bull rituals. Bull riding seems to be very prominent for them. Their religion seems to be centered around some kind of a mother goddess and a bull. And also they have a lot of mosaics, a lot of artwork that is focused on the sea. Dolphins, fish, things like that. The civilization itself was named for King Minos, and we'll be looking at Greek legends a little bit later, and you'll take a look at Greek heroes. Theseus, certainly, and the Minotaur is one very prominent heroic tale, and that was all connected back to the Minoans. The Mycenaeans they start their civilization a little bit later than the Minoans do. They're very different people. They're a very warlike people, perhaps from Russia or Mesopotamia. They have palaces and kings. They have very thick walls for defense, as you can see in this kind of recreation down here. So obviously that shows us that they are a very warlike people, and that is a major focus for them, whereas it was not a focus for the Minoans at all. Most people tend to think that the Mycenaeans in some way took over the Minoans or came in contact with the Minoan civilization and then destroyed it in some way, shape, or form. The Mycenaean civilization was based on wealth and status. And we know that from a lot of the records that are left over from the Mycenaeans. They as well are not Greeks, but these are the quote-unquote Greeks who are involved in the Trojan War. So we're going to take a little bit more of a look at the Trojan War in a minute, and you guys are going to analyze a primary source on the Trojan War. King Agamemnon of Mycenae, this is his death mask here, which was found by Heinrich Schliemann at the site of Troy, really showcases the fact that this was the civilization of the Trojan Wars and not necessarily the Greeks as we know them, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Destruction of the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations, perhaps in connection with the Trojan War, perhaps also in connection with a bunch of natural disasters that happen around the time. You basically got any centralized administration in the Mycenaean world destroyed. And then from there on, you've got about 350 years of dark ages where very, very little is known. Virtually no written documents survive from the time, and there are very sparse archaeological records as well. We do know, though, based on the time period after this, that obviously something is going on in Greece at this time. During this 350 years. Obviously, Greeks are settling in the Peloponnese, they're establishing communities. We just have no idea how they're doing it or in what ways. What does emerge in the Archaic period, the period right after the Dark Ages, is a few things that showcase that obviously during that 350 years something was going on. One key thing is the appearance of natural literature, and a lot of this is attributed to Homer, and we'll take a look at Homer in a little bit. Certainly you're going to be looking at the Iliad, but we'll talk about Homer himself as well. But he is the one who creates these epics, much like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which gives some kind of a common view to the ancient Greeks of the glorious past of the Greeks and of the gods. So that starts appearing around this time. You also have the resurgence of trade in the Aegean, and you know that because you see archaeological records, and you can tell that obviously trade is happening. A lot of it's with the Phoenicians. They get an alphabet from the Phoenicians, but you've got other objects and ideas as well that suddenly start emerging around the Peloponnese. You also have colonization. So obviously people are looking for better land. They're working around the coastline of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea. So they're spreading out around this area. Again, we just don't know a lot about how or why. We just know that suddenly these colonies appear. You also in 776 BCE have the first Olympic Games. First firm date in Greek history ever is the date of the first Olympic Games. So obviously this was a really significant thing for them, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward as well. That the Trojan War occurs right before this period, and the Trojan War is one of those stories that lives on in epic, and one of those tales that the Greeks look back to for their epic past, and for lessons about the way they should live their lives, the way they should develop society, all of that sort of stuff. Really, it's the story of the Mycenaeans apparently toppling Troy, which you can see here is on the side of Asia Minor, really in modern day Turkey. Mostly we hear about it from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Like I said, Heinrich Schliemann excavates the site, and he finds that obviously there was a city there and there was a battle there. He just doesn't know the size of the city or the extent of the battle. Regardless, the Mycenaeans give the Greeks these ideas for this heroic, epic past, and the Greeks then build on that, and they start to claim these things as their own, and they sort of establish and inspire the age of heroes. Why the Trojan War occurred, apparently it lasted for 10 years, so the epic goes, and it's Mycenaeans and Greeks versus the Trojans. When you read translations, you will see that in the translations they have the Athenians joining the war, the Spartans joining the war, things like that. None of those city-states existed at the time. Those were later adaptations and write-ins when the Athenians wanted to be part of that war, so they put themselves into the storyline. It's the story essentially of Paris, who was a Trojan prince, kidnapping Helen, the wife of Menelaus, who was the king of Sparta, supposedly, and the brother of Agamemnon, who we saw already as the king of Mycenae. And Helen was that face that launched a thousand ships, and she is the reason that this 10-year battle happens. In terms of the defeat, there is the story of Hector, the champion of the Trojans, versus Achilles, the champion of the Greeks, and sort of the tragedy that occurs there, and you'll take a greater look at that. Achilles wins. The Greeks send in the Trojan horse, full of all the Greeks who, full of all the Greeks who then destroy Troy once they're allowed into the gates. So you're going to take a closer look at this by looking at some sections of the Iliad by Homer.